Good morning, fellow whiskey lovers. Ari here, the Whisky Guy. Yes, I am in New York City, Brooklyn to be specific. I am here today to visit the Kings County Distillery. Let's go see how the whiskey's made. As the name would imply, Kings County Distillery is in Kings County. Manhattan is New York County. The Bronx is Bronx County. Queens is Queens County. Brooklyn is Kings County, and the distillery here opened up in 2010, although they changed locations in 2012. When they first opened about 6 years ago, they started off as the smallest commercial distillery in the country. Now they have moved locations into this beautiful old brick building, and they're distilling on a little less rigorous schedule. Let's go inside and say hello to Colin and the rest of the team at Kings County Distillery.
I'm Colin, and this is Kings County Distillery, which is New York City's oldest distillery. It is about 6 years old, so it's not a historical institution necessarily. But it is the first distillery in the city since Prohibition, and distilling, sort of for the past 50 years, people have associated it with Kentucky and Tennessee. But New York City has had its share of distilleries. In fact, the first distillery in all of the United States of America was actually set up in what is today New York City, but was then still New Amsterdam. So that was all the way back in 1640. And then really until the American Civil War, New York City made as much as, or at least New York State made as much as Kentucky, Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania combined. So New York was the biggest city in the country and had a lot of Irish and Scottish immigrants who moved here to build, in a way, more industrial, more commercial distilleries than some of the sort of smaller farm distilleries that you would have seen in Kentucky and Tennessee. So this was really a big industry for certainly during the colonial era, making rum, and then in the era before the Civil War, making whiskey. So obviously Prohibition sort of killed distilling in a lot of places. Interestingly, a lot of people, I think people underestimate how much urban distilling was going on before Prohibition. In places like Cincinnati and St. Louis and Pittsburgh, there were a lot of large urban distilleries, and then those died out with Prohibition. It was too expensive to keep that land for the 13 years of Prohibition, so they got sold off and the equipment got melted down. But it was really kind of the rural distilleries that then were easier to reopen, which is probably the main reason that today we drink, Jack Daniels from Lynchburg, Tennessee, or Maker's Mark from Loretto, Kentucky. It was these smaller distilleries that hadn't been repurposed that were easier to restart. So by bringing back an urban distillery, I would say that's very important to kind of what we are trying to do as a distillery, which is serve our community here in New York City. So maybe I'll just talk about how I got started as a distiller. So I am one of the founders of the business, and I am the master distiller. So I got interested in distilling because I grew up in Kentucky, and I'm from more the Appalachian coal mining moonshine part of Kentucky than the bourbon part of Kentucky, although they are very related. They are also very different. Certainly if you're from Kentucky, it's a big distinction. But when I moved to New York, I would travel back to Kentucky and I would go to our local bootlegger, who was in a dry county, Harlan County, Kentucky, and bring this moonshine back to New York. And New York is a very adventurous kind of culinary culture. You can get any food or drink from pretty much anywhere around the world, but getting authentic Appalachian moonshine was actually something that people couldn't get. And so the kind of curiosity around moonshine and the enthusiasm around moonshine and what is moonshine and what separates it from whiskey and how are white whiskey and bourbon related. Through other people asking those questions, I really got interested in distilling and got a little hobby still off the internet and started distilling in my apartment. And it was kind of through that experience of really being a home distiller or a hobby distiller that the idea for the business came around, because that is illegal, and the federal government basically says if you want to practice the craft of distillation, you must become a commercial distiller. And so that was kind of the thought behind the business, was not necessarily, oh, I'm going to create a craft distillery. That word didn't even really exist 10 years ago when this idea was going around. We called it a micro distillery, and all of the like business plan and sort of the proposals that we were putting together. But initially the idea was just to open a distillery so I could keep making moonshine and then age some of it into bourbon. Not necessarily thinking, oh, we're going to start this business and this is going to be a thing that makes money. It was really more, how can we just keep doing this thing which is really fun and really engaging and really requires a lot of dedication to succeed in a way that's not going to get anybody into trouble. So that's kind of the history of how the business got started. We got our license officially in 2010 in April, which made us the first of what are now somewhere around 20 craft distilleries in Brooklyn alone, and almost 62 or 60, somewhere in the 60s in all of New York State. New York State now has as many craft distilleries, more craft distilleries than any other state except I think Washington or California. And even twice as many distilleries as Kentucky, even though obviously Kentucky does much more volume than any of us do. But it's kind of great to be at the sort of forefront of a movement which is really returning this particular city to a much more diverse culture of distilling that reflects an earlier era in its history. So kind of one interesting episode that happened here, kind of at this location historically, was during and right after the Civil War. So during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln signed into law an excise tax on distilled spirits. So the federal government tried this once in the George Washington era, and that ended very notoriously badly in the Whiskey Rebellion. So it was something that a lot of politicians didn't want to fool with, but during the Civil War, it became necessary to raise more money. And it just so happened that a lot of the Irish immigrants to the country who were making a lot of the whiskey, especially making a lot of the whiskey here in New York, happened to be Irish. As Irish immigrants, they were often Democrats. And so the Democrats were opposed to the Republicans during the Civil War. So there was a tax on whiskey. The price went from 25 cents to $2.25 a gallon, which drove a lot of people out of business, but also created sort of the first era of moonshiners in American history. So you have in this neighborhood, today we call it Vinegar Hill, but in the 1860s it was just called Irishtown. And you have this sort of large population of illegal Irish distillers. And then here in the Brooklyn Navy Yard was a military base. You had soldiers returning from the Civil War when they were done with their contracts or their term of service. So the federal government says, well, we have to address the moonshining problem in Brooklyn. So December 1869, ships sailed from Manhattan with revenue officers who met here in the Navy Yard with 1,500 uniformed troops, who then marched out into Irishtown to go destroy illegal stills. And there's a couple depictions of this episode. This one shows a sort of very unruly scene, whereas this image is a little bit more sober. But the New York Times was around back then, and they kind of wrote an article describing women and children in upper story windows throwing bricks and cobblestones and anything that they could kind of throw down on the army to harass them. People were running through the streets trying to hide copper coils because that was the really expensive technology that a distiller used. And it became so violent that the federal government got the command to fix bayonets and charge the crowd, at which point everybody sort of finally dispersed. And it became this very successful moment in the revenue services history because they destroyed 13 illegal stills and they really demonstrated their might, and kind of initiated what became known as the Whiskey Wars of Brooklyn, which would continue for almost 2 years. and ended in 1871 when Clinton Gilbert was actually shot and killed on a moonshine raid. He was a Civil War veteran and kind of part of the Revenue Service, and happened to be in sort of the wrong pool of lamplight at the wrong time, and was actually shot right through his kind of groin, and then died the next day. And so that episode really changed the tone of, or changed the public's attitude towards distillers. People started to view distillers as contributing to the delinquency of society, or cheating the federal government out of tax money, or if you were, living in this neighborhood, they were just gangsters. They were people who would, as we would view drug dealers today. So that gave the temperance movement a lot of traction, and in fact, ultimately, temperance advocates moved to New York, knowing that New York City was, in a way, sort of the worst of the drinking cultures, and if New York City would go dry, the rest of the country would follow. And that's essentially what happened in 1920 when Prohibition 1919 when it was passed, and then 1920 when it went into effect. But interestingly, this neighborhood, which had been very Irish, became more Italian, and Al Capone was actually born across the street and grew up in this sort of rough Irish neighborhood, and may have learned the sort of bootlegging, surreptitious alcohol business from this older generation of Irish bootleggers and moonshiners that probably were still living in that neighborhood. Obviously, he would move to Chicago in 1920 and became sort of emblematic of everything that was wrong with Prohibition there, but his early years in Brooklyn may have had an impact on that. So interesting, we're in a place that people don't associate with distilling or even alcohol history necessarily, but there is so much rich history here, not just in Brooklyn, not just in New York City generally, but even in this particular location here in the Navy Yard.
It's an absolutely amazing visit to the Kings County Distillery, the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I hope you had a good time. At least that's part one. In part two, we're actually going to get into the distillery. That was a great history lesson and the story of the Kings County Distillery. Part two is coming up next, and that's going to be inside the distillery, and we're going to see inside the maturation warehouse a little bit later as well. So keep watching and enjoy.